Empowering farmers with intelligence. EFL AG-DATA presents to you.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to the EFL AG-DATA podcast. And we are continuing in our series on US-China tariff wars, reshaping Asia's feed-to-meat supply chains. I'm Alvin from EFL AG-DATA, a Singapore-based startup and sister company of eFeedLink, providing you with real-time market insights, the latest market trends in the feed-to-meat supply chains. I'm joined today with my colleague, Eric Pan. Hello, Eric.
Hello, everyone. Thank you, Alvin. I'm Eric. Today's focus is strictly on the impact on the businesses, farmers, and the supply chain in Vietnam. We believe all these actionable insights for our viewer is going to be very beneficial. The episodes for today will also split into three sections. Number one is the tug-of-war of the US-China tariff tension or war, somebody will say that. And secondly, the 90 days countdown, what's going to happen for Vietnam, how are they going to negotiate with US, and how China is going to respond to this. Thirdly, the supply chain chaos. The most importantly is who is going to be the winner, who is going to be the loser, and who is going to be whatever.
Yes. Okay, let's start this one with the tariff tug-of-war. And Eric, let's look at the big picture here.
Okay.
On 2nd of April, the US announced its so-called Liberation Day tariffs, targeting several Asian nations, and that includes Vietnam. While China retaliated with their own tariffs, Vietnam unfortunately found itself caught between these two superpowers. Vietnam also has a good trade relations with the US, and we can say that it's actually very significant.
Right.
It exports various products from electronics to textiles to footwears and even furniture.
Furniture too.
Yes. And while also importing machineries, aircrafts, soybean, cotton, and wheat. In fact, in 2023 alone, the USA trade deficit with Vietnam hits $90 billion.
That's a lot.
That's a lot. But looking at agriculture, I'd like to ask you, Eric, where does agriculture fit in all of this?
That's great questions, Alvin. Agriculture actually plays a critical role in this. Vietnam is growing rapidly in the feed industry, the meat industry, and however, it's kind of rely heavily on the imported ingredient like the soybean, the DDGS, whey powder, and other feed ingredient to sustain its rapid growing livestock sector in the past 2 decades or so. Historically, Brazil, Argentina, and the EU have been the key supplier of all this. But now, US is pushing hard to increase its shares of Vietnam agri-produce imports. For example, Vietnam imports soybean primarily from Brazil and Argentina. But if US soy become cheaper because of a strategic reason or the market move situation, having an impact from China not buying 22 million metric tons, that's going to have an impact to the US soy. With that, Vietnamese feed miller may shift a significant volume to the US soy from the South American. This is not just for the price, for the US-Vietnam trade relations. So I think the Vietnam would do this to maintain good relationship with Washington during this tense trade negotiation.
Yeah. But speaking of relations, when looking at China, I'd like to ask you, where does China factor in, fits into this equation?
Well, you look at it, it could be simple. It's very obvious that China is not a major supplier of all these ingredients, the soybean, to Vietnam. But it is a dominant feed additive supplier of the world to Vietnam, like amino acids, vitamins, minerals, and so on. So with the U.S. tariff disrupting Chinese export to U.S. and could be the surrounding, Beijing would be quietly encouraging Vietnam to absorb more, and at the same time, other ASEAN's partners to do so at the same time. They absorb more of its surplus of the feed additive because of U.S. situations. And of course, China would also, because China is also exporting some poultry products, and so the processed meats will be also kind of pushed to those countries. So, however, Vietnam is at the same time walking, how do you say? It's trying to do a balancing game here. So if it doesn't want to alienate the China or the US. However, I think during this situation, Vietnam would be in a good position to get a better deal overall.
Now, let's talk about the 90-day suspension of tariffs that the US announced shortly after imposing them. And during this window, Vietnam can negotiate for favorable terms for Vietnam. But what exactly is at stake for Vietnam here, Eric?
I think Vietnam at the same time faces strong pressure from US and also China. From the US is to increase the importations of specific agricultural products. As mentioned earlier, they have been importing a lot from the Brazilian, from the South America, especially the soybean. So I think US is going to push more on that very clearly. Pork, dairy products, and beef. So the soybean and soybean meals are top priorities because the whole animal livestock industry in Vietnam is having a big stakes on the ingredient. So that will be the priority for Vietnam to do. So US is also pushing for the greater access to the Vietnamese pork market. Although Hanoi remains very cautious due to the African swine fever recovery efforts and also the food safety concern. On the flip side, the indication that the US might offer the tariff exemption on Vietnam's key export, like the electronics, the textile, in exchange for higher volume of agri purchases. Early signals also suggested that Vietnam is relatively kind of having a relative neutral stand in the US-China conflicts of this trade war. And overall, like I mentioned just now, it will work in its favor, potentially earning temporary exemption for the delay of the tariff implementation. Also, I think that there will be more electronics and textiles business. This is to displace the China export to US because of the tense retaliatory measures of the two countries.
Yeah, right. And that said, we can say that balancing these trade demands won't be easy, right? And if Vietnam leans too heavily to the US, it would risk losing out a lot of probably investments from the BRI and even having preferential rates in terms of trade from China. And conversely, I think aligning too closely to China, it could also jeopardize its trade ties with the US. So balancing these two is not easy at all.
I think overall, I think Vietnam can benefit a lot from this too.
All right. Okay, Eric, now let's talk about the supply chain chaos. We can look at our winners and our losers in Vietnam's feed to meat supply chain amidst this trade winds shifting. So maybe you can tell us about who can be considered winners and losers.
It's very clear that the U.S. Soybean Meal Association's members are benefiting from this because they have to switch. I mean, with the pressure, they have to switch a lot of this significant volume from the South American to the U.S. That's number one. And of course, with the more efficient system of productions of the meat, the pork, and so on from the US, there will be some changes or demands and increase in the imports for this, especially for the hotel, restaurant, and the catering business in Vietnam. And overall, I think that the consumer will be benefits from this. However, not everyone benefits. There will deemed to be some loser. Some of the smallholders farmer that's producing alternative feed ingredient like the rice bran, the cassava, and so on will be facing more challenges in the incoming lower costs and quality of other ingredients. So they may be losing out in that sense.
Yeah, yeah. And well, when we look at long-term trends, I think Vietnam is actively diversifying its suppliers, to avoid the over-reliance of either bloc. And for instance, actually, Vietnam is exploring deals with Australia for beef,
Of course.
and also India for soybean meal, and looking at the EU for wheat. So additionally, the government is focusing on the domestic supply, the self-efficiency domestically, particularly in the pork production, which I think also is a big contributor to Vietnam's economy. And of course, to mitigate external shocks like ASF and also international price swings, right?
Yeah, and of course, so around the world now, everybody is kind of doing kind of more modernized and putting emphasis in a lot of other things. And same thing, Vietnam will be kind of focusing on the sustainability. That will be another emerging trend. And as global consumer demand for more transparency and so on, and Vietnam stakeholder are placing greater emphasis on sustainable practices in feed sourcing and traceability within the meat supply chain. And with this trade war, I think the source of origin of the ingredient and so on will be more having a better transparency, which the consumer would like to see.
All right. Yeah. All right. And we'll look into it more. And during this 90-day period, of course, EFL AG-DATA will be there to give great insights to the industry on how this tariff and this trade wars between these two superpowers will affect us all here in Asia, right?
Yep.
Yeah. To our viewers, thank you for tuning in into that episode on the Vietnam tariff battles. And if you like that, please consider tuning in for more episodes by following us in our social media channels and subscribing us in our YouTube channel. And stay informed, stay tuned. See you next time.